Thanks for joining in today. Um, so thanks for coming to the presentation today. It's my honor to welcome Dr. Ali Menzies, who's going to speak to us today. And before we do, I'll just do a land acknowledgement and start by acknowledging that the ancestral territories of those lands that we're currently living and working. Since this is a UBC Okanagan event, probably many folks in attendance are in Kelowna, and that's on the ancestral lands and unceded territories of the Syilx Nation, the Syilx and Okanagan Nation. But many of you are probably joining us from other regions, including our speakers. So, we encourage you to reflect on the lands in which you live and work and who the ancestral caretakers of those lands might be. I'm Clayton Lamb, and I'm a postdoc at UBC, and I'm joining you today from the homelands of Ktunaxa First Nations in the southeast corner of British Columbia. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ali Menzies, who's a Métis scholar originally from Manitoba, which is within Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territory. Ali recently completed her PhD at McGill University, where she used animal-borne data loggers to characterize physiological and behavioral responses of boreal mammals to fine-scale environment variation like temperature and daylight and resource levels. Ali is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Wildlife, Indigenous Science and Ecology Lab at the University of Guelph, and she works with in partnership with Nature United and Indigenous groups across Canada to identify important Indigenous values to consider in environmental monitoring. And importantly, Dr. Menzies was recently awarded the prestigious Libera Fellowship, which is awarded to 4 emerging conservation scientists across Canada each year. And I think this speaks to the role of Ali as an emerging leader in this field, and I think acknowledges her achievements to date. So before we get going, so everybody knows, you can post your questions in the Q&A at any time. There will be an option at the end also to raise your hand and use audio as well. And this event is being recorded, so if you don't wish to have your voices recorded, you just opt out of doing that verbally and use the Q&A. And after that, I think over to you, Ali. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Clayton, for that intro. And thanks everyone who's able to be here today or watches this in the future. And I'm super excited to be here and give actually the first ever seminar on my postdoc work. And I'm really honored to do so in your diversity in biology seminar series. So thanks for doing the land acknowledgement for the university and the place that you are. But I also just wanted to situate myself in place before I start. It's a good chance to share a photo of what Manitoba will look like in the summer and say hello from where I'm calling in from. And I also want to acknowledge that part of my role as a privileged person and the descendant of both a Métis and settler ancestors is to reflect on my connections and responsibilities to this place. And also how my own work can advance the efforts of Indigenous folks to regain sovereignty and nationhood and the rights and responsibilities over their lands. Next, I also wanted to contextualize this presentation in my own identity and expertise. Part of the reason is because, admittedly, when I was invited to speak at a diversity in biology seminar series, I really had to think about whether this was my space to take up, or if it was really my voice that's needed. And that's because while I am a minority in science, I am Métis, I am female, I'm also extremely privileged. I'm white, I'm educated, and I'm able-bodied, I'm many things, and I've benefited immensely from those aspects of my identity. But what it really came down to was that I wanted to share with you today because I want the opportunity for the voices of the folks that participated in the research that I'm about to share to take the forefront and to contribute to creating change in the way the environment is cared for. And I saw this as a platform to do that. And as Clayton said, I'm a wildlife biologist by training, specifically more of an ecophysiologist, and transitioned more recently from my postdoc into using more diverse and interdisciplinary tools. But I really do identify as a wildlife biologist and just borrow those tools from other experts. So I hope that you listen to what I have to say today with credibility, but understand that my expertise lies in more of environmental and wildlife biology and Western science and my own personal experience and identity. And I don't speak for others, or especially not all Indigenous people. So again, really important to acknowledge all of my partners and collaborators that made all of this work possible. I started this project as a postdoc when a lot of it was already in the works. I created some new opportunities, but definitely relied heavily on partners and pre-existing relationships to First Nations and environmental groups. My postdoc supervisors are Jessie Popp at the University of Guelph and Amanda Karst at Nature United. But this work wouldn't be possible with all of these folks listed here. So I wanted to start this presentation just by making what I think is a bit of an obvious statement that Indigenous stewardship is critical to the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems worldwide. Indigenous lands are one of the oldest forms of conservation units, if you will. Customs guided by Indigenous laws, traditions, and beliefs are the oldest form of what we now call monitoring and management or stewardship. They're often referred to the original stewards of the land, going back to time immemorial. But currently, Indigenous people also play a critical role. Indigenous peoples have tenure rights over about a quarter of the Earth's land coverage. The species richness is generally higher in Indigenous lands than non-Indigenous lands. And all of that combined makes it clear that Indigenous peoples have a very important role to play in how we move forward in terms of our relationships with the land. Whether this is actually recognized or not, or whether Indigenous peoples are invited into the important conversations, they do serve a critical role. And there's increasing recognition of laws and policies in constitutions at local, national, and global scales for the rights of Indigenous peoples to care for and make decisions for the land. In 2007, the United Nations passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is described as kind of the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And I just wanted to highlight Article 25, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied lands, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations. And I think the wording of this is pretty huge. It emphasizes the Indigenous right to land. It emphasizes spiritual relationships, and also emphasizes responsibilities to future generations. And so it places emphasis on Indigenous peoples as rights holders and not as stakeholders. And again, playing an integral role in lands and protecting lands into the future. So whether it's due to these changes at higher levels in terms of policies, whether it's due to individuals realizing the value or recognizing the value of Indigenous knowledge, or somewhere in between some broader social scale movements, Indigenous knowledge has become highly valued as a source of information for scientists, for biologists, ecologists, botanists, climatologists, and researchers across disciplines. It's important to note that Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge is not new. It is just the integration or the acceptance of these things as valid or useful that is relatively new. And these screenshots of papers took me 3 seconds to find this many. There's so many papers in recent years that highlight Indigenous knowledge in the scientific literature. But with all of that bubbling under the surface, we're really at a critical point in this journey where there's ample movement in the right direction, but we really need to proceed with caution to ensure that we move forward in a good way and not in a way that continues to perpetuate harm on Indigenous peoples. We cannot continue to extract, appropriate, or misinterpret sacred knowledge of the land to benefit colonial agendas or institutions. We can't do what is sometimes referred to adding Indigenous and stir, just adding Indigenous peoples or Indigenous knowledge and expecting that alone to lead to better outcomes. Because that does nothing to the inherent power structures or colonial underpinnings of almost all the systems that exist to protect and conserve the environment in our society today. So in my opinion, and in broader opinion, what's really needed is complete transformational change, and not just of the knowledge and information that we use to make decisions about the environment, but actually the way we think about nature and our relationships to nature and what we are grounded in. And a really stark difference between Western and Indigenous approaches are the values that ground us and that guide our beliefs and our actions. And it's not as black and white as Western versus Indigenous, but just for a little tidbit of information, the values listed in the Constitution of Canada is peace, order, and good government. Whereas the values that are often attributed to Indigenous peoples are place, relationships, and values like respect, reciprocity, and humility. And I think this language is important. These words and this mindset drives our behavior and our societal beliefs. And so I think we need to get back to values that have less to do with good government and more to do with relationships with each other and the environment. And through self-determination and empowerment, I really think that Indigenous peoples are going to be the leaders that guide us back to what it means to live sustainably. So today, what I want to talk about is a bit more about what does this all mean? That's all well and good, but what are these values and what could this relationship with the land look like? How do we actually create environmental programs that align with these values? And so what I'm going to share is insights from interviews with Indigenous community representatives from across the country, hearing from the people on the ground, not just academics in the literature, but people who have actually been affected by the lack of good practice in the past and who experience poor behavior and colonial institutions on the ground. And then I'm going to provide some case studies of research that I really think embody these values in practice in hopes that it can provide some inspiration or clarification moving forward. So the interviews come from what we called the Canada-wide Knowledge Gathering Initiative. And what this was a community motivated and initiated project. So two of our partner communities, Magnetawan First Nation and actually Gitanayah First Nation, wanted to expand understandings of weaving knowledge systems and what it means for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to work together. They wanted to be heard and they wanted their perspectives to be the forefront of this conversation. So we started a project where we conducted virtual interviews and sharing circles, which resulted in us talking to 40 individuals from 12 First Nation and Métis communities. A lot of them were part of the Anishinaabe Nation, just through our pre-existing partnerships, and then kind of snowballed from there to include a few others from coast to coast. The questions we explored had to do with if and when knowledge systems should be brought together, important environmental practices and values, and how to create values-led environmental programming. The first thing I wanted to share was, again, this mindset of how we relate to the land and how we care for the land. So we specifically asked interview participants, how do you care for the land? And the first thing that emerged was, instead of people referring to specific actions or methods, most people spoke to the fact that it's actually embedded in who they are, embedded in their culture, and emerges from relationships to the land and to their culture. So one individual said, it's part of you, it's part of your life, it's part of your mind, it's part of your heart, that you are truly a guardian and protector and steward of the land. Another individual stated that the environment actually teaches us what we're supposed to do to keep it intact. The animals teach us how to interact with them, to keep them intact and us intact. The environment tells us these things and we develop our language around that. So these responses really reflected a need to have strong and good relationships to the land in order to care for it in a way that it desires. And I'm going to use this diagram or this visual throughout, where because of these insights, creation and natural law and all living beings are at the center. And then these values that are important to relationships with the land emerge from that. Many participants talked about responsibility, and you may have heard of responsibility-based management. And it refers to the fact that Indigenous peoples have a responsibility to creation and to the creator, to live well, to respect the land, but also a responsibility to future generations. There's a teaching that I think is one of my favorite teachings I've ever heard or learned, that we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think that this mindset is a fundamental shift in thinking, that we have a responsibility to gift a healthy environment to future generations. So this individual said, it's our territory. We were given responsibility to look after the land by the creator. We enjoy the land, we live on the land, and the land provides us with everything that we need to live, but then we pass it on to the next generation. Another core value is respect. Having respect for the land, not disrupting it, not capitalizing on it. And respect was inherent to almost all the other values, because respect can be shown by not being wasteful, giving thanks for what you're provided, being mindful of your impacts, respecting your position within creation, and giving back to the land. And all these values I'll describe a little bit further. But this individual said, we respect animals, we give thanks. When we do a killing, we use every part of that animal because they gave their life for you. It's almost unsaid, teaching that you respect the land. You don't go and you don't disrupt it, you leave it as it is. It's a body of its own. It's a living, breathing system of its own that we're a part of. We are not above, we are not below, we are just part of it. There's no capitalizing on it, I guess. Another foundational value that a lot of individuals shared was reciprocity. The understanding that there's a give and take between people and the land, that you care for the land and therefore it will care for you in return. And it was also pointed out that sometimes the land needs people to be healthy. So the act of harvesting something can actually advance their life cycle. And so to me, this really spoke to the idea that humans and the environment are integral to each other, and that in order to protect the environment, it's not about removing humans from it, it's about getting back to the space where there's a reciprocal relationship. So this quote reads, understanding that something is taking care of us, therefore we ensure that that thing is able to continue to take care of us, so we take care of it in return. Others mentioned gratitude, being grateful for what the creator has given us and acknowledging that. And others, moderation, only taking what you need. Both of those things were mentioned quite a bit. And mindfulness, so being very mindful where you are and what you're doing, being very careful where you're stepping, because you might be stepping on something that is of value. Another one participants mentioned was humility. So they emphasized the need to understand that humans are not above anything else. And to care for the land, it's really about managing our own behavior and relationships to creation, as opposed to managing creation or the environment itself. Individuals pointed out that humility also allows us to listen to the land, hear the teachings, and learn from them. So this individual stated that we're not separate from the environment and we're not above anything that's in the environment. That's a really important value that I think the greater society should be trying to implement. We don't manage the resources, we actually technically manage our relationship to the resources. And finally, people mentioned the fact that the land has agency and the land has spirit. And I think that that's an important thing that is lacking in Western thought and Western society is acknowledging that the land can manage itself and that we are here to simply allow it to do that and manage our own behaviors. So the next part of the interview, what we actually asked was, now that we've talked about this mindset and how it needs to shift a little bit and what is important, how do we actually create environmental monitoring and research programs that align with these values and that can actually help these values flourish? And we really got into a lot of practical things that are more about the approach to research and monitoring that we hope to provide guidance to environmental professionals with. So the first thing, this visual now I expanded into being a dream catcher, and I liked this visual because dream catchers are about protection and protecting you. And I think that all of these values that we talked about and practices are really about protecting the land into the future. And so the first feather, or the first practical guideline that was talked about by a lot of people, was to identify and listen to community priorities. So this individual says, allow our community to say what we need. I think people coming in and saying, it looks like you guys need this, or I will give you this if, yes, it's allowing this community to ask or to see what is needed and help in whichever way that is, which is, I guess, sovereignty, being able to enact whatever our race and whatever our traditional law states, and that's what we need. A lot of folks talked about seeking guidance from elders in research. So elders and knowledge holders are the ones that have seen the land change the most, and the land users who are using the land, they're seeing those changes as well. So allow elders to really guide where the research is going and what the priorities are doing, and also share the teachings that they have learned from the land that allow them to embody all these important values. Next is to prioritize youth involvement. Probably teaching our young ones is one of the highest and most important values. It's instilling those connections and nonverbal experiences and understandings with our young ones. So nearly all interview participants talked about youth as one of the highest priorities of the community. So for environmental professionals or environmental programs to create opportunities for youth to be involved, providing the time and space for them to learn about the land and their culture, this should be a top priority in what we do. And since really strong relationships with the land and culture were described as being central to the ways that participants care for the land, again, it's central to this circle of values as creation itself. A lot of participants emphasized that fostering connections to the land is really the best way to ensure that the way we care for it is guided by important values and teachings. This individual says we need to go to the land, go to our camps, and go in the bush and connect with the land. Feel the medicines that are there and how therapeutic that is to be on the land. Just enjoy what nature has to offer and the connection with your family and your friends. That becomes really good quality time. Some other individuals also pointed out that having community members on the land throughout doing research and doing the monitoring is an avenue to not only connect community members to the land, but demonstrate that the community is actively caring for and protecting what is important to them. So visibility as stewards on the territory was also really important. Creating opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer was also part of what people talked about in terms of engaging elders, youth, and going out on the land. Expressed as by one person as every time you step foot in the forest with someone, a knowledge holder, the class is in session, and making sure that there's opportunities for younger people to experience, be out on the land and on the water with knowledge holders and elders so that they have the avenue to learn and to carry on those values. We always are taught that we're born with these values. It just sometimes takes the opportunity to see them in action, to implement them within yourself. And a lot of folks talked about the use of traditional language. I think since English has become the dominant language, it's difficult to really see a lot of these traditions and values and culture in a lot of the processes because the language is so inherent to understandings of the land and to teachings and to the connection to it. So this individual says the language is the knowledge of the land. When you're describing the land and how you see it and how you experience it, the descriptors of what that experience looks like are tied within that language. Even some of that is hard to convey or translate into English and not always available to everybody. So the importance of using language in our practices and the way we talk about things, in the way we write about things, was another priority that a lot of folks highlighted. And building a sense of community. So community involvement is very important because when you get buy-in from the whole community, then you have a whole team working on one thing and we all have the same goals and priorities. So to create environmental programming that is less top-down and more kind of horizontal leadership within a community ensures that it moves forward in a good way and has buy-in from the entire community. And the last thing was to build good relationships. And in our dream catcher visual, relationships are depicted as this red thread that ties everything together. Relationships to the land and to each other is what ensures that all of these values can emerge from creation and that we're all creating environmental programming that is grounded in these values. And so this individual says, I think building a relationship with the community, both like mine and others, but that's very honest and very sincere from the beginning. It's not focused on any one thing or any goal. Like the goal should just be honest and sincere relationship building so that you feel comfortable. It's less like a business relationship or a contractual relationship and more like a friendship. So I know that was a lot of things to take in. But just to summarize and just to reflect on, I found it really interesting asking the question, how do you care for the land? I think if someone asked me that question, I would kind of have a tough time answering that. But what emerged from that was all of these important values and the idea that relationships and connection to place are critical for how we care for the land. And that's something that I do think that Western or broader society needs to get a little bit closer to. And then prioritizing Indigenous values in practice requires, again, good relationships built on these values, prioritizing shared concerns and desired outcomes, engaging youth and elders, creating opportunities for knowledge transfer, and fostering connections to the land, language, and culture. So this approach to research and environmental programming is as much about how research is conducted as it is about what is being conducted. And I think beyond this presentation and into the future, it's really important to reflect on how could you prioritize these values throughout the research process. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time reflecting on and that everyone that works in our research group thinks a lot about before we even go out and start conducting research. So for the next few minutes, what I wanted to share was a few case studies of work that's going on both in the WISE lab, where I'm a postdoc, and also a little bit beyond, that I think really embody some of these values. And I selected these case studies because I think they do so in different ways and they focus on different contexts. So the first case study I wanted to share is related to wildlife monitoring initiatives that are rooted in these basic principles and approaches from the WISE lab itself. So one project is in partnership between Magnetawan First Nation and two master students from our lab, Claire and Kate, who are pictured here. And they're creating a monitoring program using camera traps to monitor both moose and biodiversity. And then the other project that I'm going to lump into here is my own work with Mississippi Cree Nation and Nature United, where we are supporting the development of guardianship programs in their territory, specific to moose and also a little bit broader. So I'm going to share kind of some details of these projects and how they came to be and try to identify the important parts of the process that allow these values to be at the forefront. So in all cases, partnerships really came first. Relationships among the research team, local lands department staff have been years in the making. Time and energy and effort are really put into creating and maintaining these relationships. And it's considered the first and perhaps most important step of the research process. And then once these partnerships were in place and these relationships were in place, that's really when conversations started happening about what are the priorities and needs of everyone, starting more with larger environmental issues or land use planning, but then focusing in on tangible pieces that could be made into master's projects or specific questions that can be answered. So in both cases, moose were identified as a community value, and many people voiced concerns about declining populations. And then also biodiversity as a more holistic approach to monitoring as opposed to focusing on a single species. And I wanted to specifically highlight these two because I think they're interesting case studies in that, for one, moose is not listed as a species at risk, but is in decline in a lot of places in central Canada. So there's a lot of tensions between cultural perspectives and experiences versus the more colonial way of considering what is an important conservation concern. And then this idea of monitoring biodiversity as opposed to a single species aligns well with a more Indigenous holistic perspective of the environment as opposed to focusing in on single species. So I think that the fact that both of these were priorities for the communities kind of points out how we got to points where we were focusing on things that were important from an Indigenous lens, but also important scientific information to have for various reasons. So from here, we settled on data collection needs, which honestly were very focused on a lot of scientific metrics like abundance, density, species richness, critical habitat, changes over time in the context of moose harvest information. Sorry. And from there, we designed programs based on these data needs and shared priorities. I think a really important piece of working across cultures on supporting leadership of Indigenous peoples in these conversations is to allow for data collection that is both appropriate for what is needed, but also accessible. So in these projects, we're using a mix of trail cameras, which are set up in a grid across the territory to take photos of wildlife, winter track counts, where individuals from the community will go out on snowmobiles on predetermined transects and count animal tracks in the snow. And then land user surveys, both in person and on tablets, where land users, in some cases youth, in a lot of cases elders and harvesters, will document their observations and knowledge when they're out on the land. So all three of these methods can provide useful population information like abundance, habitat preferences, activity, species richness. But what really makes them ideal in the context of these projects is the way that they align with many of the values and priorities of the communities that we heard in our discussions. The first is that they are non-invasive, which all of these are, and that was a priority in a lot of conversations. The second is that they provide or can provide more holistic data. So they can provide species specific information, but can also provide more holistic understandings of what's going on the territory, including environmental changes like phenology or timing of major events. And because of the accessibility of the methods, but also the data that they provide, they offer huge potential for community leadership and engagement in the process, deciding on locations for cameras and track transects, physically deploying the cameras and doing the track counts, surveying hunters, identifying animals in photos, interpreting survey results. These are all opportunities for engagement of not only researchers and lands department staff, but the broader community. And then finally, in the same way that they get people out on the land, there's an opportunity for pairing youth and elders to go out together and to ensure that knowledge is transferred during that time on the land. And then a key component to this work is the added value of the research to the community, the researchers, and the environment that emerges from prioritizing things like reciprocity and relationship building. And these are seen as integral parts of our research approach and process, and the continued support from the community and our partnerships. So I just wanted to share some examples because I think, when you say prioritize reciprocity, a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? What can that look like? And so some examples of these values in action are collecting garbage when we're out in the field. This is something that gives back to the land and the community and is simple to do when you're out there all by yourself. The two master's students, Claire and Kate, helped with the Magnetowan Lands Conference, so supporting their community initiatives and ensuring that they are successful. When we were in the field one day, one of the turtle breeding, or one of the turtle nests was flooded, and so we helped collect those eggs, and then in the future, as part of their turtle breeding and releasing program, Claire and Kate got to release the turtles that we saved back into the wild, so participating in their species at risk programs and their programs that are important to their community. Spending time in community, so doing things like swimming in their waters, eating lunch together, and then also respecting customs and traditions and respecting the culture. So this picture in the middle at the bottom is a picture from a trail camera showing someone laying down tobacco at a moose carcass that was found on the railroad tracks. So just taking a moment to offer gratitude or to say thank you for the life that this moose gave, to apologize. I think that's a really important step to convincing people that you respect and value their knowledge system and their beliefs and their culture, and to do it together can be really enriching. And all of this leads to better and more fulfilling research partnerships and I think research. So the next case study I wanted to highlight is an example of infusing knowledge and teachings into public spaces and educational materials. So Brad Howie is an Anishinaabe environmental educator, and he was a master's student in the WISE lab. He's initially trained as a biochemist, but then moved more into environmental science as a personal journey. And he talked a lot about his journey as an Anishinaabe scientist and what this project meant to him. And a quote from his report on this project states, "The elder that was interviewed for this project urged me to listen to the teachings and to stop only thinking with my mind, but think with my heart. This is what the elder called my heart mind. This was hard for me to do, being trained as a traditional Western scientist and having to remain objectives in any papers I wrote. To open my heart mind, I had to open myself to the culture, to the language, to the ceremonies, and to the knowledge and the people." So I think that Brad shared a lot about his own journey, but a journey that I think a lot of people who are trained in the Western sciences have to go on in order to come to a place where we can really actually come together as peoples and as cultures. And for him, it really changed what this project meant to him. So what his project was to help indigenize or weave Anishinaabe science into the Arboretum at the University of Guelph, which is like a public natural space in the university. So first he created a new logo for the Arboretum, rooted in what the project was really trying to accomplish. And according to Brad, it wasn't just for people to walk through the forest, it was to actually feel and consider what it means to be among the trees. And so that's the word that he chose for this project, Mitigwaki, which is among the trees. And then he created 4 signs that he put throughout the Arboretum as you walk through the path. And he developed them as a story about seeing the land from an Anishinaabe perspective. The signs enable people to connect with nature and reflect on 4 questions, one on each of these posters. The first poster was an introduction using the medicine wheel. The yellow portion of the medicine wheel represents early life. And so within this yellow portion of the medicine wheel was the introduction to this project. There were QR codes in the corner of each poster for accessibility, but also to honor the oral traditions of Anishinaabe and many Indigenous cultures, and to hear the pronunciation of Anishinaabe words. The first poster, the question is, how do I enter the forest? And this gets the reader to reflect on what parts of you are you bringing with you. The Anishinaabe see themselves as more than just intellectual beings, and the medicine wheel teaches that we have 4 states of being: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And all of this is explained on this poster and says, to enter the forest, you should go in with more than just your intellect. Let your heart, mind start the journey. And it also uses the Anishinaabe word for hello, or ani, which doesn't simply mean hello. It can be translated to, I see your light. The second poster read, how am I related to creation? So after being among the trees, you come up to this poster and it asks you how you're related to everything else. The main graphic is 7 images to represent 7 grandfather teachings. And the circle contains a tapering line of thickness as it represents the transfer of energy and biomass throughout the ecosystem. As you go deeper into the forest, you're supposed to go deeper into your spiritual and thought journey. And the third sign asks the question, what can I give to the forest and what does the forest give to me? This sign is meant to educate people on the concept of reciprocity. So the image here are 2 hands clasped together in the shape of a heart. And by walking hand in hand together as nations, this is how we're supposed to get back to walking the good path, or in Anishinaabe Moen, Mino B'mad Dezoim, which is also known as the good life. And finally, the last sign that you reach in the Arboretum is a call to action, asking how do we treat our mother, referring not to necessarily your biological mother, but all of creation. And so it gets people to think about, now that I've gone through this journey and thought about all of these things, how do I actually want to treat the environment, and how am I related to it, and how do I give back to it? And so this project brought in language and brought in culture and brought in this weaving of different knowledge systems into a public space. And I think it really changed the experience from just walking through the trees along this path to actually reflecting on how you relate to it and what it means to you. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, I'm not going to explain this project. I would say if you want to know more about this project, you should ask your colleagues, Clayton and Adam Ford. But I really did want to give a nod to this project because it's a really great tangible example of what can happen when Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks work together. And this time it led to observable, quantifiable impacts on recovery of a species at risk and a cultural keystone species. So I think this points to the importance of self-determination of Indigenous peoples and working together to create a place that is better for both wildlife and the people that rely on it. So reach out to Clayton if you want to know more about this project, but I think it's a really fantastic project. So through those case studies, what I hoped to really portray was that prioritizing Indigenous values in practice can include a lot of things. It can include building partnerships early and prioritizing relationship building throughout, identifying shared concerns and working towards them, using methods that are accessible and align with community priorities, spending meaningful time, infusing language and teachings, and supporting Indigenous sovereignty and the right to self-determination. And I think all this comes down to really redefining what the research process looks like, to prioritize these values and to really reflect on how could you infuse these things into your own research and teaching. For the last couple of slides, the last couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about this question that we asked interview participants: how can outsiders help? And now we didn't really define outsiders, but most people interpreted it as non-Indigenous people. And so I've created 4 slides to give tips on how to ensure you're engaging in a good way with Indigenous people, and how to ensure that these partnerships are better moving forward. It's a combination of responses that folks gave from the interviews and just my own thoughts. And the first one was almost all participants talked about the need for people to educate themselves and do their homework before they start, to kind of go on their own journey and make sure they're actually committed to reconciliation and good partnership. So this could involve learning about the land and the treaties or lack thereof, reading books, learning more about legislation and laws that govern Indigenous peoples, taking courses. There's one at University of Alberta called Indigenous Canada. There's also a training program at Queen's called Indigenous Community Research Partnership. And learning about culture. So in the bottom right-hand corner is some tobacco ties that I made with Jesse, my supervisor, and learning about what that means and what good customs are for when you engage with folks in different communities. The second, I think, is to learn more about yourself. And you may have heard the word positionality. And I think as natural scientists, we tend to kind of ignore this side of things and in fact try to pretend that we are all objective people. But your positionality or your identity defines what you know to be true and valid, and also how others interpret things that you say or do. And so positionality refers to the social and political context that creates your identity, referring to things like race, ethnicity, gender, ability, age, sexuality, religious beliefs, and how this influences your understandings and outlook on the world. So to reflect on things like, who are you? How would you identify yourself? How would others identify you? How does this shape your research and your relationships? Our worldview shapes everything that we do. And I think it's a little bit simple to think that as scientists, we are objective and we aren't biased by anything about ourselves. How does your identity relate to power, privilege, and authority? And when and where are you an insider versus an outsider in your research or in your personal life? And this is really important and honestly not something that privileged folks have to think about a lot. It's been a lifelong battle or journey for me to understand these elements about myself and how I fit into different spaces. Identifying both as white and Indigenous, as someone with immense privilege, but also a minority in a lot of scientific spaces. And how does this relate to my role as an academic and where I step up and use my voice versus listen and let others speak? And I think this journey has been really rewarding. Identity is fluid and ever changing, but I think it really leads to more grounded and self-aware research and research relationships. Switching mindsets from consultation to true partnership. So in this image on the right, the ladder of participation, consultation is considered a form of tokenism. So not engaging in a way that allows people to truly participate, but just asking them after the fact is a form of tokenism. And so shifting towards meaningful engagement and involvement. And this is actually a quote from an individual in our interview saying, scientists need to remove the whole concept surrounding the idea of consultation and shift to more of a meaningful engagement and involvement. We're going to blow up your land, but here's our plan. It may or may not work out for you, but now I can check off my box because I told you. That's what it needs to shift away from. There needs to be a more meaningful approach that involves the First Nation with regards to how their land is going to be disturbed, inclusive of the knowledge that they hold and including the value system. And I think there's movement towards this, but to really reflect on and think about when you're reaching out to folks and when you're working with them, is there opportunity for equal participation and partnership, or is it just a consultation approach? And finally, to bring it full circle, and because my presentation has been all about these different values, I think it's important to be grounded in shared values. We talk about Western society being grounded in things like money and greed, and Indigenous societies being grounded in reciprocity and respect. But I think as human beings, we are all grounded in similar values. And I think we need to get back to that in our professional lives as well. So just to reflect on how you embody these values in your research, in your relationships, and in the way you interact with the environment. It can be difficult to think about, but I think really important when you move forward in your professional relationships. And so there's so many more ways that researchers can do research in a good way. That maybe is how you've heard of it. I've put some resources here, and feel free to take a screenshot of this, or if you watch the video later, just write them down. But Dr. Andrea Reed from UBC has a really great presentation exactly about what it means to do things in a good way. And then there's also guidelines about the same thing, how to be an ally to Indigenous-led conservation and an Indigenous ally toolkit. And they all outline different things of how to approach research in a way that's more respectful and reciprocal. So my last slide, I just wanted to finish on a final reflection, and it's a quote from the book Decolonizing Methodologies. And it says, the intellectual project of decolonizing has to set out ways to proceed through a colonizing world. It needs a radical compassion that reaches out, that seeks collaboration, and that is open to possibilities that can only be imagined as other things fall into place. Decolonizing methodologies is not a method for revolution in a political sense, but provokes some revolutionary thinking about the roles that knowledge production, knowledge hierarchies, and knowledge institutions play in decolonization and social transformation. So I really like this quote because the words I bolded, compassion, collaboration, and really to think about the role that knowledge production and knowledge institutions, which we are all part of, and universities play in social transformation. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and feel free to contact me if you have more questions than what are asked today. And I am very happy to take questions and have a larger discussion. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that, Ali. That was amazing, and I mean, I think it was a great overview, and also, pretty cool to see that it's being applied on the ground. I mean, I think that we talk a lot about weaving knowledge systems and how to work in a good way, but it's pretty important that you're actually doing it on the ground and come from a place of knowing how to do that and can share that with us today. So thank you very much. I see maybe a question. Nope, just raving praise about your talk. I guess maybe I could start it off with a question, and then other folks can follow. I mean, I actually have a few, so I could go for a while, but I'll ask one, and hopefully other folks jump in. I guess one question is about sort of the academia and in First Nations or Indigenous link, and how the grad students play a role there, especially in relationships. Like, it's such a short period being a grad student. Like, it can be a year and a half, or it could be 4 years as a PhD, but like, how do we sort of manage that relationship with also the high turnover of these students? Like, what do you think a good way of structuring that as a PI might be, or as a grad student?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so throughout my PhD and continuing till now, I did a few workshops with grad students of how to work better with Indigenous communities. And that was honestly the question that came up the most. I felt like a lot of graduate students felt really powerless, or really like paralyzed by the fact that master students have 2 years, and they come into projects that are already set up. They come into relationships or lack of relationships that are pre-existing. The whole idea of going to the field, coming back to the institution, there's not that much time. And honestly, I'm not sure. I honestly think it has to come from the top down. That's like my maybe unsatisfying answer for graduate students. But it really has to come from the folks that are around longer and that have the power to decide what money is spent on and what is important. And so I think it does have to be this more institutional shift and shift from maybe PIs downwards. But I always try to encourage the students to advocate for what is important to them. You have a lot of freedom in your own journey in grad school. And if it's something that's really important to you, to build relationships and to be on the ground, to advocate for time and money and space to do that. Hopefully you get encouraging responses, but I think that's part of the role of a lot of us who end up in these privileged spaces like universities to advocate and to create space and to be the agent of change a little bit. And I know it's hard at the grad student level, but I think it's important to try. And again, there is a lot of freedom. It might end up, your master's is then 3 years instead of 2 or 2.5, but in the grand scheme of things, I think that's okay. Your supervisors may disagree, but I think it's just having these conversations with people that are part of your journey to emphasize the things that are important to you and what you think is important. So I guess that would be my answer.
Thanks a lot for that. I think that makes good sense. I mean, UBC has an example. They have a form relationship with the Silkatine national government now, and it's sort of at the institutional level, and students sort of come and go from that. So yeah, I think that's an example of what you're saying from the top down. Okay, there's a couple questions. One came in from Ondine Park to start. It says, Western science aims to generalize and discover universal objective knowledge, and Indigenous knowledge systems are developed in relation to specific territory and local relations. Is there a risk that the scientific drive towards generic knowledge will end up co-opting or colonizing Indigenous knowledge for this purpose?
Yeah, short answer, yes. I guess there is a risk, but I think, yeah, that's a really tough question. I think that is a huge risk, and I think that is something that we all have to be aware of and reflect on. We can't like pan-indigenize. We can't just say that everyone is the same. But I think there's also power in numbers, or there's a lot of folks who see the same things and want the same things and need the same things. And I think finding the commonalities across these place-based experiences and knowledges can be really powerful, but then also highlighting the differences alongside that. So even in our interviews, we interviewed folks from coast to coast and of all different cultures. And we did pull out a lot of commonalities in terms of beliefs and philosophies and worldview and needs and concerns and all of that, but also tried to highlight where there were important differences. And so I think that is a risk, and it's always going to be a risk. I think talking to those who shared knowledge with you and how they want it to be interpreted is important. And I think really just being specific about the context in which it was gathered and what it can offer to the bigger picture. And I think we're supposed to be doing all these things with science too. And it just like, I get what the question is and I understand the risk, but I also think that it can be maneuvered in a way that is both specific to where the knowledge is experienced and broad, or speak to broader themes and things like that. But that is a great question and a great point, and I maybe don't have the most satisfying answer, but
I think that was great. Thanks, Ali. Another one here from Dawn. Maybe I'll just summarize. There's a number of questions sort of within one. It's basically about how the research process works, right from data sharing agreements through to compensation, and then all the way through to whether folks have the opportunity to review the documents and ownership of the data they provided, like maybe just a quick rundown of what that pipeline looks like.
Yeah, so I actually, in the projects that I spoke of today, I'm not sure that there's any written data sharing agreement, and that's like a really good point, and that's something that is suggested to have. There's definitely open communication at all points, and an understanding that the data is owned by the community, and that what the students do with it and what we do with it is at the discretion of the community. And so there's constant reporting back, constant communication. We share results back to the community members and offer time for reflection and feedback. But I think that written, signed data sharing agreements are quite important because, things can go sour, tensions can emerge, differing goals can emerge later in the process. And so I think it is really important to think about how to formalize those agreements, especially in the context of Indigenous knowledge. What constitutes data, what constitutes something that can be shared versus something that can't. It gets really, really tricky. If you're walking on the land with an elder and they share a teaching with you, is that data? Is that shareable knowledge? Or is, it's all these things that are quite tricky. And so I think having open communication at the start and creating these data sharing agreements is really important. We always write up reports or summaries of the stuff that we're doing and provide them to the community and talk about that stuff. But yeah, I think formalized things are probably better from the start.
Okay, another one from Courtney Beauchamp. Am I able to use your slides and figures from your presentation for my future papers or presentations for class, provided I cite your presentation?
Sure. Hopefully soon they will be papers that you can cite, but yeah, maybe just reach out to me first, but I am totally willing if you want to take screenshots of things, or if you want to rewatch, or if you have taken screenshots, that's totally fine, as long as a lot of this is still kind of, well, not preliminary. We just shared it with the communities yesterday to get feedback. So things might be tweaked a little bit, but generally I think the messages are pretty clear, and I don't mind if you share those messages as well, as long as you kind of cite where it came from. That would be my answer.
And Ali, you just had a paper published today, didn't you, on climate change and community interviews? So there might be something in there too folks can look to.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Maybe not the same, but maybe something similar.
Mm-hmm.
Robin, I'm fairly, oh, go ahead.
Ali, I have a question. It was maybe you could share your screen again for a minute. It was on your slide about the communication. I think it was the second last slide, or 3 from the end, where you were talking about sort of the drive-by scientist versus the, embedded, mutually respectful. Could you just share your screen again? Because yeah, that's the one. I was a little puzzled by the educating versus informing, how those differed, and also why educating, as an educator who tries hard to engage my students in meaningful, respectful interactions, why that was listed as non-participatory. And so if you could just elaborate on that a little bit for me.
Yeah, so admittedly, I did not make this ladder of participation, but from my understanding, it's just more about, in the context of science or education, and Indigenous partnerships going into a community and educating them on the environment or on conservation, as opposed to providing space for more participatory involvement. And so depending on what that education looks like, it can be very top down or one-sided, or whatever it's referred to, the sage on the stage, as opposed to more participant driven. I actually have no idea the difference between informing and educating. Maybe informing is just being part of tokenism, as opposed to just non-participation is more about where it's coming from, just informing folks of what they need to know, kind of thing. I forget what your second part of the question was.
No, I this is fine. It's just a,
That's a good point. I think education can be all of these things as well. I guess it's just more of the perspective that's brought in when doing so.
I
Perhaps.
certainly take you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I realized I was interrupting.
Okay.
I think part of this might be the context in which it is done. And that education can be coercive if somebody goes in and wants to achieve an aim via, hey, I'm going to give you all this information and then act in a certain way, as opposed to a much more open-ended joint inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I'm just thinking an example of dropping into a community and saying, by the way, moose are declining, therefore we have to shut down harvest or something. It's like we're telling you the state of the environment and we're telling you the outcome of that, as opposed to let's have a conversation about it, or what do you think, or what do you see, things like that. So I think it's like there's a different level of participation in all these things. And I think non-participation in my mind is perhaps better than tokenism, but that's up for debate too. But it's just I guess the approach to information sharing and maybe who has the power or who's considered to have the knowledge that's worth sharing, I guess. I'm not sure, but yeah, that was a good question. And I think that yeah, it might just have to do with the power dynamics of the situation, I guess.
Well, if those are maybe the bulk of our questions, then maybe we can end it there. I mean, I have some other ones, but I think Ali and I will probably spend some time together in Ottawa in the coming weeks, so I'll save them there and maybe report back if anything's, if my questions are groundbreaking or not. But thank you everybody for joining, and especially a thanks to Ali for taking time out of your day and sharing this important knowledge and perspective with us, and just helping us understand how to both position ourselves with our appropriate backgrounds in the research, and then and sharing your background and place with us as well in such a transparent and good way. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I think we all do. And yeah, I think we can end it there, and wish everybody a good day.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for providing this space and for all your questions.
Committee, can we just stick around for a couple minutes?
See ya.